So my goal with this presentation is to give you some tools that next time you're in a conversation that's pitting metrics against traditional game design, you have something to bring to the table in the conversation on both sides of it. This is originally a presentation I did with Brenda Brathwaite at GDC, so thanks to Brenda for her part of this presentation. So what we've been experiencing for the past couple years is nothing short of a collision of two worlds between traditional games and social games. And that's created a lot of friction. Honestly, from someone who's been on both sides of the equation, I think it's needless friction over everybody who's sharing the same goals. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So some of the potential outcomes from this friction we're starting to see in the marketplace, right? Especially over the last year. So one thing we're starting to see is traditional game companies like EA, for example, starting to consume social game companies. And then, of course, you have the other side of the equation, which traditional game companies are worried about, that some of the social game companies are now getting big enough to start consuming traditional game companies. There's a third potential answer here, though, that we could have better games and processes by a result of bringing the knowledge from both of these worlds together. And there are definitely ways to do that. Both of these worlds think they know the right thing to do, right? They both believe that their way of doing things is the right way because they've been doing it that way successfully for years. So some solutions have been trying merges, right? On the traditional side, they're buying social studios and they're hiring social devs. On the social side, they're hiring traditional designers, like us, and trying to buy studios, right? We're trying to merge these things together. But there's still a lot of disregard on the other side. So it's amazing on both sides of the equation how frequently you hear people in the social space dismissing the way traditional games were made, and on the traditional side, dismissing PMs and metrics. So it's really about traditional games versus social games, but even more than that, at its heart, it's about game designers versus PMs. And I think it's been set up as a conflict. In the end, I'm going to say it doesn't need to be. And at the heart, it's about intuition versus metrics. So I'll talk for a second, just so we're all on the same page. The traditional development, the intuition side, typically goes like this. Somebody has a great idea for a game. It can come from a lot of different places. It can come from the top of the company. It could come from one of the designers on the team. It could come from a brainstorming session, right? But traditionally, it starts with this great idea. And then you take that and you figure out, okay, what's it going to take to make this great idea into an actual game? And you try to think it through from A to Z. How much you documented that varies from place to place, but typically you are definitely thinking from A to Z. And once you do that, then you start to develop and iterate on the team. And you work and you work and you work at these elements of the game, and you continue to iterate until the team thinks that the mechanics are fun. And then at that point, you polish, as long as you're given, which can be a very short period of time sometimes. But you take whatever you can get, you polish, and then you ship, and you're done, right? So that's traditional game development. On the other side of the coin, though, in social development based on metrics, if you're really developing from a metrics perspective, you're going to start with a concept that has been focus tested. So you're going to start with something that has already won a metrics battle against other concepts. You're going to do a short pitch, and then you go straight into development. You don't spend a lot of time documenting it because you want to spend as little time as possible working on this before you expose it to an audience. So you're developing the minimum viable product. And then you ship it at that stage, which to a traditional developer sounds crazy, but for metrics-based development is absolutely the right way to do it. And the iteration and polish comes after you ship, so that you only iterate and polish on things that you know players like and respond to and that are monetizing well for you. So we're talking about two very different processes here. But what I want to focus on is the fact that they have the same goal, which is to make a game that's so great that players want to pay you for it, right? That's our goal here, is to make something that's so fun that people spontaneously want to just give us money for that experience, right? So let's talk for a minute about intuition. And this is the way most people who deal with metrics all the time think about intuition, right? It's a fuzzy voodoo science. There's nothing behind it. It's just a hunch. It's just a guess. Why would you ever risk money on your gut feeling about something? So I'll start off with a success story of metrics to tell you why, or of intuition to tell you why metrics didn't necessarily get me there. So in Free Roams, we at launch realized that we were bringing a lot of people in, but not a lot of them were progressing past level 1. So I was looking at the metrics at the time, and I said, okay, It's because they can't explore the 3D world very well, right? It's a mechanical issue on their part, because we had seen this with some of the players. And so I added a Take Me There button. The Take Me There button, when you clicked it, would run you directly to the location of a quest giver, so you could get the quest from him, right? So you didn't have to explore the 3D world. Did a little bit of help, but it really didn't solve it. So then we added direct teleport. Now you can teleport directly to the quest giver, right? And when I'm still watching the metrics, it moved the needle a little, still didn't do it. What I didn't realize, and I never would have figured this out by metrics alone, is that it was because players didn't want a quest. They wanted to play with their pets, and they wanted to party, and they wanted to put on fun outfits, and they wanted to dance. That was the first thing they wanted to do in the game. And to give them an experience that was more guided was never going to get them there. And I could have continued to follow the metrics all I wanted, and I would have kept honing it in and gradually improving it, but I would not have come to the conclusion that I came to by getting in the game, playing it, looking at players, and going with my instinct and my experience. So let's talk about what metrics can't do for you. Metrics can tell you what's happening in your game for sure. It can't tell you why. The why is the important part of what's happening. If you know what's happening but you don't know why, it's almost no better than knowing what's going on, right? You absolutely have to know why players are doing the things that they're doing. And the reason for that is because player choices, same thing Raph was saying, they're emotional. People are making these decisions for reasons that numbers can't really explain. And they're never going to be able to, right? You have to be able to get in the player's head to understand their choices. On top of that, actions don't tell you the whole story. And this actually is a classic example of that a lot of times someone will look really pleased with a gift that you gave them because they don't want to disappoint you. And players are no different than that. You can't really tell why someone's doing something just because they did it. And this point is super important. Just because the metrics look good doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. People do things they don't want to do all the time in games. And they start off with a goodwill toward your game that erodes over time the more they take actions that they don't like. And they'll continue to do it because they like your game enough to push through it. But you're eroding that goodwill. Just because people are willing to pay for something doesn't mean they like paying for it or they feel like they're getting their money's worth. Metrics don't tell you the whole story. So here's how most game designers think about metrics people, right? Being counters, worried about the money, not worried about the fun. So here's the story from Brenda, which I'm sure I will not retell as well as she did, about when her intuition failed and metrics saved the day. So she was designing a system, I believe, for Ravenwood Fair, and she's got years and years, unprecedented actually, track record in the RPG industry. So she was using her best experience as an RPG designer to design the system, I believe, for coin sales in Ravenwood. And luckily, she got some metrics early on in beta testing that told her how wrong she was about her instinct, because the social players were behaving differently. Ravenwood Fair was pretty different from other games that came before it, so they didn't have a good example to look at until they got the data. And the data that came back was that rather than wanting to accumulate large numbers of coins for a big expense down the road, social players wanted to have things in the store that were priced low enough that they could buy something every day. And it was a revelation to her. She would not have gotten there on her own, right? She needed the metrics to tell her that she was wrong so she could come back and make a better decision. And that's really where it's at with metrics, because you can't really look at what people do from a subjective stance in the game and what they say, because it's very true that what people say, what people do, and what they say they do are three very different things. And you can't necessarily go by them. The only truth that you can really look at is metrics, to say, what are they actually doing? Tell me what they're actually doing. And actually, let me stop real quick and say, the best example of this is if you've ever done a focus test or a survey and you ask people if they spend money in Facebook games, you get almost 100% no, even though that's not the actual percentage of people who spend. They will never admit that they do. So here's a big point in terms of why to use metrics. You don't represent your target audience unless you're making games for game developers. So everybody sitting in this room, you may think you represent the target audience. I'm telling you, you don't, because you're sitting in this room. So your target audience is almost certainly less tech savvy, less likely to go look for new things, less likely to experiment than you are. Their interests are very different from yours. And unless you're getting the metrics on your design, you're designing for yourself. And that's a super dangerous thing to do. Another reason for metrics over intuition is because iteration works best when it's in front of live players. You can keep tinkering away at your design like this dude forever. right? And make incremental improvements. But until players are telling you whether or not they like it, you're wasting your time. I think there's a certain amount of it, right, that needs to come out of the conceptual phase, but like any mad scientist, at some point you have to actually see how your experiment does in the wild, or you're never going to know anything. And then this, metrics does this for us, right? It helps us remember what happened. It's way too easy to walk away from an experience when you don't have metrics and say, well, yeah, I kind of feel like those 3 things we did didn't really work, but this time we're going to do it, right? We're going to do the same thing, we're going to do better, and it's going to be better this time. When you're looking at the metrics and you're actually understanding how much players hated what you did, it's a lot harder to do the same thing again. So how can we merge these things together? How can we get these 2 sides to work together? And this is where I start thinking about, the conversations that I've been a part of on both sides of the equation. So the first thing I'll say is intuition is not a hunch. When you say, I have a hunch about something, or I have a gut feeling, or I have intuition, it is years of experience and observation that's talking. It's like the difference, it's firsthand witness information. That's what you're bringing to the table. So anytime anybody tells you, is this a hunch? No, it's not. It's years of experience that's saying this. On the other side, though, you have to think about it from the metrics perspective. You need to give game designers respect, because they are approaching things unafraid to go into new territory, and they've been doing that for years, right? Before we had metrics, game design was about taking your best bet and putting it out there and seeing how it went, and that's a really brave thing to do. So without any figures, you're relying on your own instinct, and sometimes that's an important thing to do. But the other thing to remember is that metrics are more than numbers. It's the voice of players. So anytime there's a game designer on the side of equations saying metrics don't mean anything, of course they do. These are your players talking to you as directly as they can, right? Way more directly than they ever will in a forum. And if you ignore that, you're ignoring your players. So let's give PMs some respect on that side of the equation, right? They're trying to understand players to make better games. That's at the foundation of every time they're bringing metrics to the table. That's their goal. I want to understand players because I want to make a better game. So you can look at it this way, and here's where the 2 things work together. Intuition is the map, it's the plan, it's the broad vision for where we want to go with this, but metrics are weather reports that help us steer, right? And the more information you can get that's going to make your design successful, the better off you are. You should crave metrics. You should want to get metrics as soon as possible so you can see how well the things that were in your head are actually playing out. So the biggest advice that I can give for this on both sides of the equation is to look at the game holistically. You have to get to the why. Look beyond the metrics, and this is where it really is a combination of metrics and intuition, because your metrics can tell you what's happening. It takes intuition to look at players and understand why that's happening, and the why is what's going to help you make this game better and the next game even better than that. But even beyond that, be willing to absorb information from everywhere. All of these things are toolboxes. Don't reject intuition, don't reject play experience, don't reject metrics, don't reject forums, don't reject community, don't reject player meetings, right? If there's a meet and greet somewhere, all of this information is incredibly valuable. And then I wanted to end with this, because I always, when I talk, am trying to expose information and things that I've learned on different projects. And I think this is super key, because it's easy to feel like you want to hoard data, but honestly, information helps everybody, right? We all benefit when we share knowledge of what works and what doesn't in our games. So this is just more of a call to everybody here to be willing to share metrics, to be willing to share what you've learned, right? Because a lot of the times in the intuition versus metric spectrum, you have the people on the intuition side who have a lot more experience in the game space, right? They're trying to share their knowledge, and they're getting denied at the door by the social side because they want to build games the way they build them. And on the other side, you have the social companies that are really resistant to listening to the years of experience from traditional game designers. And somewhere in between, there's a great benefit to be had for all of us if we just share this knowledge with each other. So, thank you.